Thanks for that. Okay, well, I shall be acting as the devil's advocate here today. I should add to Mary Bowen's generous introduction that I actually spent 10 years here in Edinburgh. I was a student here and I did my PhD here and I was on the staff here briefly, so I know the city pretty well. In fact, I lasted rather longer than Charles Darwin did, who came to University in Edinburgh but couldn't stand it. I think he couldn't stand the weather myself, but he claimed that he couldn't stand the sight of blood because he came to train at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh to be a doctor, and in those days, of course, medicine was a very savage pursuit, and he fled screaming from the room when they saw somebody operating on a young child without anaesthetic. And do you blame him? So that's the background. What I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about religion particularly, I'm going to talk about science. I'm only a scientist. But oddly enough, religion and evolution seem to be the only sciences that really clash, and I never understand why that should be. Religion and chemistry don't clash. Religion and the theory of gravity don't clash, but for some reason religion and Darwin seem to have constant disagreements. It might be because they claim at a first glance to be looking at the same question, which is, where did it all begin? Where did we come from? What made us what we are? And that's a very sensible question, and it's been answered, of course, in many different ways. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this illustration here, which is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now, that's a very beautiful metaphor of human origins. It was written perhaps 2,000 years, or perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and if you trace back the dates of the prophets in the Old Testament, as Archbishop Usher famously did, you can work out that this actually happened in 4004 BC. Now, many, many people have believed that, until Darwin. Perhaps in Europe, most people believed that. But of course, worldwide, there have been many other models of origins. That theory could be true. And as I say, it was a very popular one. In some ways, it still is. But it's not the only story of human origins. Here's one that may be less familiar with you. This is the Chinese god Pangu. And according to Chinese belief, what happened was that there was a cosmic egg floating in the void, which cracked long ago. And this gentleman here, Pangu, emerged, appeared on Earth. He grew for 18,000 years until his head reached the sky, which was 30,000 miles high. His head then exploded, and his eyes became the sun and the moon, respectively. His tears became the world's rivers, and the fleas and lice on his body became the ancestors of men and women. And that's a different story about where we all came from. And that too could be true, certainly could be true. But one thing is very clear, the Adam and Eve story could be true, and this one could be true, but they can't both be true. And the problem is, of course, you can't differentiate between them except by what you've been told to believe. There is a different story, which I have quite a lot of confidence in, and I think most biologists do, and it is, of course, the story told by Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species, which came out 150 years ago this year. In fact, it came out on November the 24th, so I hope the castle will be lit and there will be fireworks going off on November in 6 or 7 weeks, which is the 150th anniversary of The Origin. And The Origin of Species is a wonderful book, which I'll come back to in a moment, which Darwin called One Long Argument. And his long argument had to do with where life emerged and how life and species had evolved. He actually says almost nothing about humans in The Origin. He just says one pregnant sentence, light may be cast upon man and his origins. That's all he says in this book. But 12 years later, he wrote another book called The Descent of Man, where he talked at some length about human evolution. So he's clearly talking, hinting hard about human evolution here. Well, that's the theory which is, I would say, universally believed by biologists, but it certainly is not universally believed by the general public. We all know that the majority of Americans don't believe it, but I was rather shocked to see this opinion poll, now 2 or 3 years old, where the BBC Horizon programme asked some slightly loaded questions, I have to say, about what people think. These are schoolgirls and schoolboys, people of your age, roughly speaking. What do they think? Less than half believe in the evolution theory, but a fifth believe in the creation theory, which is sort of Adam and Eve-ish in one way or another, and about the same number behave in the intelligent design theory, which I won't talk about because it's so unintelligent. It's just a kind of creationism. So really, there's not much different. There's a high proportion of British young people who do not believe in Darwin's theory. Now, I find that surprising, and what I hope I'll manage to persuade you is that Darwin's theory has a huge amount of evidence behind it, and that it tells us a great deal about where humans come from. It might not tell us everything about what it means to be human, but that's a very, very different subject. Why do people get so excited and annoyed about the theory of evolution? I think it's well summarized by this cartoon, which is shown here from the allegedly humorous, in fact deeply unfunny journal called Punch, which went bust a few years ago, but was very big in Victorian times. And this was published just after The Origin of Species came out, and there had been a great uproar among the intellectual public and the church at the time, and it's called Mr. Gorilla. And here we have the ultimate horror of a gorilla dressed, obviously a rather well-off gorilla, probably a fellow of the Royal Society of London, if not of Edinburgh, who walking in perfectly dressed into a dinner party and asking to be announced as Mr. Gorilla by this unfortunate servant who was completely shocked and horrified by the experience. And what this summarizes really in rather an amusing way is what many people thought that the theory of evolution did. It turned human beings into just another animal. It took us off this unique peak upon which we had thought we resided, utterly separate from the rest of the world of creation, and reduced us to the level of the apes. And if that were the case, if we were just apes, as Gilbert and Sullivan said, Darwinian man, though well behaved, is really but a monkey shaved. If we really were shaved monkeys, why shouldn't we just behave like apes? Why shouldn't we just be bestial and cruel and all the things which, of course, we aren't most of the time? Okay, so that's, I think, was a reasonable concern, which people talked about, and after a few years, I think creationism in the 19th century more or less went away, although it's certainly come back again in spades. That idea, though, is still very much around in a slightly modified way, to me, in actually a rather more sinister way, and it's greatly promulgated by people like this lady here, Jane Goodall. Now, Jane Goodall, who you may or may not have heard of, because she's less prominent now than she was a few years ago, but she was a very well-known and still is a very active student of animal behavior, a very brave woman who went out and lived in the jungles of Africa for several decades, living more or less with chimpanzee, gangs of chimpanzees, and discovering indeed that chimps aren't charming, cuddly animals, they're actually horrible. They tear each other to pieces and eat other chimpanzees, and are mean, nasty, and vicious, and all those things. And Jane Goodall discovered all that, but she also gained a great deal of respect and affection for her chimpanzee subjects. And she's very active in a movement called the Great Ape Project, which suggests that because chimpanzees and humans are so similar in their DNA, which they certainly are, and I'll come back to that a little later in the talk, that actually chimpanzees are almost human. If we believe, as people used to believe, that chimps have got about 98% of sharing of human DNA, it's actually a bit less than that. But if that were the case, what Jane Goodall suggests is that chimpanzees actually deserve 98% of human rights. Now, that to me is a very peculiar argument. Bananas have got about 50% sharing of human DNA, and there isn't an argument that bananas have got 50% of human rights, but it's actually exactly the same argument as the argument we saw in that cartoon. That actually really, apart from some trivial differences, we are apes and apes are us. Nowadays, it's not that we've been brought down to the level of the apes, it's that evolution has brought the apes up to the level of human beings to be almost the same. And that, too, is an idea which disturbs some people. It disturbs me, first of all, on the grounds I think it's simply wrong. And secondly, it disturbs me because I think it shows a deep misunderstanding about what the theory of evolution and indeed what science is all about. So let me talk about what evolution actually is. And I think if you're going to argue with anti-evolutionists, it's a thing which I try to avoid, you need to know what the facts are. It's no good just saying, oh, everybody knows Darwin was right. Darwin was right, but we need to have evidence. And what I hope I'll be able to do for the next few minutes is to give you some of the evidence, a very small part of the evidence, of some of the way in which evolution actually works. Well, The Origin of Species is quite a long book. It's 150,000 words long. I have read it, unlike the vast majority of other biologists. In fact, I read it several times. There are several shorter versions about. But it can be summarized up in 3 words, which Darwin thought up. Evolution, he said, is descent with modification. Descent, the passage of information from one generation to the next. Modification, the fact that that passage is not perfect, that mistakes are made. We can rephrase those pregnant 3 words in modern language as evolution is genetics plus time. That's all it is. Genetics, a mechanism of passing down instructions from one generation to the next in DNA. Mutation, the fact that that mechanism is imperfect and the errors are made. And time, 3,500 million years since the origin of life, plenty of time for plenty of change to take place. Now, that's the center, the core, the kernel of the idea of evolution. There's a second part, which I'll return to in a moment, about natural selection, but that's slightly an add-on. And it's an old idea. Darwin himself was the first to admit that he did not come up with the idea of evolution. He never uses the word evolution in The Origin of Species. The last word of the book is evolved, but the word evolution does not appear in it. So the idea is old. But Darwin was the first person to apply it to biology. I often think that what Darwin's work did was to turn biology into a single science. Before Darwin, there were plenty of people working on plants, on discovering new kinds of creatures under the sea, on animal behavior, on breeding sheep and cattle, on human anatomy, on birds, migration. All these things were being studied by perfectly competent, sometimes very brilliant scientists. But nobody realized that they were all actually doing the same thing. They were studying evolution. I sometimes think that if biology is a language, evolution is its grammar. You can't speak a language unless you understand its grammar. Now, we all speak perfect English because we understand its grammar deeply embedded in our brains, so much so perhaps that we don't realize that we do so. I have the rather unfortunate hobby of learning languages. I speak reasonable French and Spanish, and to do so, you really have to get to grips with grammar, and that's almost the most difficult thing to do. And that's what evolution did, give biology a grammar, a kind of framework upon which you can hang all the astonishing facts of today in a single unitary narrative. And that was really its greatest contribution to science. And it's ironic, really, that before Darwin, evolution was so widely used by students of language, by students of vocabulary, and by students of grammar. Here's a guy who I guarantee you've never heard of. He's one of the few, perhaps the only, distinguished Jones in the history of science. This is Sir William Jones, who was an 18th century schoolboy at the school Harrow in London, which is only advantage is that it isn't Eton. William Jones, like all schoolboys in those days, and I'm sure in Scotland, all schoolboys and all schoolgirls today, could speak fluent Latin and Greek. He also could speak Hebrew. He learned all the European languages, more or less as a hobby. And when he was a young man, he was sent off to India, and we're talking about 1760 or so, to work as a merchant, and he started studying Indian languages too and learning some of those. And he found to his great surprise that certain Indian languages were actually rather similar to those of Europe. That was quite startling. You've got to remember, of course, that in those days people believed in the biblical story of language, the Tower of Babel, that we were forced we were obliged to speak different languages because we'd been so quarrelsome, and the initial language of the world had broken up into new ones which were created in an instant. But what William Jones realized actually was that languages are related to each other. And what do we mean when when we say that languages or people are related? We mean that they share a common ancestor. Okay, and William Jones gave a number of examples of that. Here's some rather simple one. Here are some English numbers, 2, 3, 7, and 10. In Latin, rather similar, duo tres septem decem. Greek, not so different. And in Sanskrit, which is an extinct and highly literary language spoken in northern India, but with a big literature left behind, again, 2 is dva, 3 is trias, 7 is sapta, and so on. They sound a bit the same. Now, what William Jones thought, hang on, they must be related. They must have descent with modification, from a common shared ancestor. And he drew the first ever evolutionary tree, and this is an evolutionary tree of the word father in different Romance languages. In French, it's père, in Spanish, it's padre, and so on. They descend from the Latin pater, which is not very far from the Greek pater. We're talking languages spoken 2,000 years ago, quite close to the Sanskrit Peter. And what you can actually do, and what William Jones did, is actually try to work out what the ancestor of that word was in the language, the ancestral language, which gave rise to Greek, Latin, Gothic, and all the rest. And he came up with a word that sounds a bit like pater. Okay? And that word is in a language which has now been reconstituted, called Pi, for Proto-Indo-European, spoken many thousands of years ago, perhaps in the Crimea. The people who spoke this language began to spread to the west and to the east, and as they moved, the language changed. And of course, we can see that happening around us. I think it's less true in Scotland, actually, but certainly, of course, there's a difference in spoken English between Scotland and England. To my ear, the Scots accent of 2009 is not very different from the Scots accent of 1962 when I first came here. But certainly the English, the London accent of the students at UCL in 2009 is very different from what it was 40 years ago. Now they all say, can you tell me where the next lecture is, mate? It's just right. Is it down the corridor down there? They all speak like that now. Well, in my day, they used to say, could you tell me where the next lecture is, please? Is it down the corridor? And that's evolution, okay? That's descent with modification. And if it goes on for long enough, you will generate separate languages. And if you make the rather daring assumption that that process takes place at a regular rate, which is not necessarily entirely true, you can actually put dates on that, okay? Here are some dates at which various languages are supposed to have split apart from each other, worked out from what we know of their history over the last, since written language has begun. As you've probably already noticed, I'm not speaking my native language at the moment, because my native language is Welsh, which I grew up speaking until I was 5 or 6. It's an insular Celtic language like Gaelic, and then there are Romance languages, German languages, and the like. English and French sound rather similar, but actually English is a Germanic language in its structure, and the guess is that the Romance and the Germanic languages began to split about 2,000 years ago. They split away from the Celtic languages about several thousand years before that, and then you can go all the way back to these to the Indian languages, even older. And if you're a real optimist, and this is really very optimistic, you can actually put all the languages of the world together on a family tree, some of which are very distinct, like K, which is the Kung Bushman language, or A, which are the Aboriginal languages of Australia, which are totally distinct from all others. You can put them on a tree with dates on, and you can work out, with a lot of hand-waving, that language itself actually began maybe 35 to 60,000 years ago. So that's what evolution actually is. It's descent with modification. And that's, we can see it happening, we can hear it happening with language, and as we'll see, we can see it happening in biology. Now, Darwin's second contribution, and this has been described as perhaps the cleverest idea anybody has ever had. Well, that seems to me a bit over the top, but it was a clever idea. Darwin's second contribution was what he called natural selection. What you can think of as inherited differences in the chances of reproducing. He saw that if any of these changes, these mutations as we call them today, were more able to copy themselves than others, perhaps because they allowed their bearers to survive, or to find a mate, or to have children, have offspring more frequently than those who had an alternative form of that particular gene, then that particular new mutation, that new error, would be more common in the next generation and would spread through this process called natural selection. And over the years, these new forms would build up. They'd allow creatures to adapt themselves to particular environments, and in time, new forms of life, new species would emerge. I often think of natural selection as a factory for making almost impossible things. Everybody in this room is an almost impossible thing. Some of us may be a bit more impossible than others, I don't know, but we're all highly unlikely objects. And many people think, the intelligent designers think, that we're such complicated objects that somehow there must be a big man with a white beard who actually designed things like the eye, the ear, the elbow, or the fingernail, because it's so complex you can't imagine any simple mechanical process giving rise to it. Well, that's simply wrong, and I can illustrate that in many ways. Oddly enough, my own first exposure to natural selection came before I went to University of Edinburgh, when I made the perhaps rather mistaken decision at the age of 16 to leave school and start working in a soap factory, training as an engineer, which I did for a year. And I'm very glad I did it, I have to say. I learned an awful lot. But in soap factories, detergent factories, the way you make detergent, washing powder, hasn't changed in its principles for 100 years. What you do is you take a great vat of boiling hot chemical liquid and you push it through a nozzle. And it goes zooming through this nozzle, in at the left, out at the right. And as it comes zooming out the other end, it cools and breaks into two phases. It breaks into a vapor, which is then steam-like stuff, which is blown away and condensed and used again, and a powder, which is collected, and that's basically a soap powder. Okay, and one of my jobs in those days was to take out and clean those nozzles, and they were about this big. They made of stainless steel, very heavy, beautifully machined, very expensive, and they were useless. They kept getting blocked. They didn't give you a standard size of grain. You had to change the nozzle for every kind of liquid. It was just a pain. So in those days and before, the people who owned the factories and the shareholders and the like, they employed lots of intelligent designers, mathematicians, physicists, to try and improve the way those nozzles worked. And they had some, but only some, moderate and limited success, because to understand the way, the chemistry and the physics of the way in which a liquid turns into a vapor plus a solid, is what's called a phase transition, is really very difficult, and it's still not fully understood. So almost in despair, the researchers stood back from all this hard physics and chemistry. They went to the easy science, biology, science for idiots. They went to the easy science, and they began to apply Darwinian principles of natural selection. I don't think they realized what they were doing, but that's what they did. What they did was to use descent with modification. They took that nozzle, and they made 10 copies of it. Each one changed purely at random, slightly from the original. Okay. Then they tested those 10 copies with the liquid in the factory, and maybe one of them was just a tiny bit better than what had gone before. So they took that one and made 10 copies of that, slightly changed from the original, and repeated the process. We had inherited differences in the chances of reproduction or natural selection. Only the best ones, even if they were only a tiny bit better, only the best ones won, only the best ones were allowed to reproduce or to be copied, although I don't doubt that they very much enjoyed the experience. And really, quite quickly, some quite remarkable things began to happen. This is a rather crude, old model of what happened from generation to generation. You can see evolution by natural selection of a piece of machinery in a factory happening in front of your very eyes until after 45 generations, you end up with that. That works 100 times better than what went before. It's an almost impossible nozzle. Nobody designed that. Nobody could have designed that. Nobody knows why that extraordinary shape works so fantastically well. But it does. And this approach of evolving your machinery, and it's widely used in things like jets and turbines and that kind of stuff, or evolving your computer program, where you simply take an enormous computer program and let it change at random and run them against each other and choose the best ones. This is now absolutely standard in the world of industry. So we accept it in the world of industry. What I don't understand is why we can't accept it, so many people can't accept it in the world of life. So that's what Darwinian natural selection is. And let me just give you a couple of simple examples of it. I often talk about HIV and AIDS, but that's a bit painful, so I'll give another example now. If a Martian were to come and land on Earth and start describing the plants and animals who live here, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he found that if he really decided that there were several species of humans here on the globe. There were black people, generally speaking, in Africa, white people, generally speaking, in Europe, people with characteristic facial features in China and Japan, and so on. What we call races, I think any taxonomist just describing them would be quite reasonable to call them different species. Of course, they aren't. And one of the things which is most startling about us as human beings is how astonishingly unchanged we are genetically from place to place across the globe. We're really very, very similar, except that is in physical appearance. And when it comes to physical appearance, the thing which matters is most striking of all is, of course, the change in human skin pigmentation across the globe. And we all know that we vary in colour. Before people began to move around, we vary in colour, varied in colour quite strikingly from the tropics to the north and the south. That's due to a pigment called melanin. And we didn't used to know much about melanin, but now we know a lot. It does all kinds of interesting things. Everybody has melanin. But people have different amounts. Black people have more melanocytes, as they call, melanosomes, as they call, in their skin, and white people have fewer. People with blonde hair and pale skin, fewer still. And melanin does all kinds of interesting things. It protects against skin cancer, for example. It means that if you've got black skin, particularly for women, if you've got black skin and you go out into the sun, that doesn't really matter. But if for pregnant women, a white-skinned pregnant woman who sunbathes is putting her unborn child at some risk because the ultraviolet light that comes flooding in through her skin actually destroys circulating vitamins like folic acid. Pregnant women are sometimes advised not to sunbathe as a result. White skin ages more than black skin. People with black skin have better eyesight than people with white skin and blue eyes, and that's well established. Somewhat surprisingly, people with black skin tend to have better hearing, particularly in later life, because the black melanin pigment is actually found inside the ear, where it soaks up some of the biochemical detritus that's produced in cells in just the same way as it soaks up the damage done to the skin cells by ultraviolet. So everything we know about black skin is good. In that case, why, outside Africa, do so many people have white skin? And now I think we know the answer, and it's more or less clear. It has to do with exposure to sunlight and with vitamin balance. Here's the picture of a child with a particular illness called Rickets. And Rickets is an illness which, certainly in the 19th century, was a great killer of children across the British Isles. In Scotland, probably more than in England, certainly as much as in parts of England, that's for sure, more than in parts of England, because Rickets is due to a shortage of vitamin D. And vitamin D, as you probably know, isn't really a vitamin in the sense that we understand other vitamins to be, because vitamin C, for example, we have to get from our food, eating fruit and vegetables. Vitamin D we can make ourselves, nearly all the vitamin D we need, through the action of ultraviolet light, sunlight, on certain body chemicals, which turn then into vitamin D. If you have a shortage of it, all kinds of nasty things happen. First of all, your bones aren't properly laid down. It's involved in metabolizing calcium and phosphates and that kind of stuff. And you have this soft bone disease called Rickets, and as you can see, this unfortunate child, its leg bones are badly turned in there, and it would have great difficulty in walking. If you were to go over to the necropolis in Glasgow, let's say, an extraordinary cemetery, and dig up the children who were buried there in large numbers in the 19th century, when Glasgow was a booming industrial city with plenty of cholera and nasty diseases around, you'd find that many of them, perhaps most of them indeed, would have signs of Rickets. That's no longer true in Britain in general, but worldwide, Rickets is still the second most common non-communicable disease, non-infectious disease of childhood. So it's still a big problem. And recently, in the last year or so, there's been a great deal of interest in the discovery that vitamin D, a shortage of vitamin D, is involved not just in the dangers of rickets, but in lots of other things too. If you have a shortage of vitamin D, it turns out that cancer can be much more aggressive than if you have sufficient of it. The illness multiple sclerosis, which is a very unpleasant disease which removes the sheath, the covering from nerves, seems to be associated with climates in which there might be a shortage of vitamin D. There's even been the suggestion, which I think is a bit over the top, that the the definite difference in health between Scotland and England, and everybody knows that Scottish health, the Scottish men's health, particularly on the west coast of Scotland, is considerably worse than it is in England. That might actually be due to the same thing, a shortage of vitamin D. And why should there be a shortage of vitamin D? Because the weather's bloody awful, that's why. Okay? And that's really why we evolved white skin. When people began to emerge from Africa around 100,000 years ago, around those times, and began to move, and moved off to the horrible climate of the north and west of Europe, or the almost as horrible climate of China, let's say, anybody with a relatively light skin was favoured because they could make vitamin D. Those who retained black skins were not favoured because they couldn't make enough vitamin D. Their children did not survive. And so very quickly, genes for light-coloured skin spread through the population. And the evidence for the effect is really quite strong. For example, if you look at European Americans and African Americans today, these are the levels of vitamin D, the safe level being around 50 on this vertical scale here. You'll see that the dotted line, the African Americans, who are the solid lines, throughout the year, they get more in the summer, but throughout the year, most African Americans are below the recommended levels of vitamin D. Most European Americans are around at the right level or above the right level and do much better in sunlight. So the effect isn't small, it's big. And oddly enough, in Britain, vitamin D is coming back among particular communities, particularly the Islamic communities, and particularly among women in Islamic communities, who, first of all, perhaps rather rarely go outside, and if they do, cover themselves completely with clothing, which means that their skins never see vitamin D, and indeed some of them show signs of vitamin D deficiency. So the effect is a strong one. It's happened quite recently, and it's led to evolution very quickly. One rather amazing spin on that story is that if you look at the DNA, it turns out that Europeans have become white in one way by damaging the melanin factory in one place, but Chinese and Japanese, who also lost most of their skin melanin, have become white in a different way. They've damaged the melanin factory in a different place, and so evolution, natural selection, has just picked up whatever alteration, whatever mutation appeared, and used it in an unthinking kind of way with no planning. That's white skin. There's another little spin I mentioned briefly. One of the great mysteries of modern human biology has been to understand the origin of the following mutant. Why is the following mutant so common? Okay. This is our intellectual Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, a menace in human form if there ever was one. And this is Boris, in a characteristically thoughtful mode, but you can see that he's a blonde. Okay? What's the origin of blondes? What's the point of blondes? You've been asked this. Let's remind ourselves how rare blondes are, or were. Okay? Until about 300 or 400 years ago, when people began to move across the globe, blondes were really confined to a very small part of northwest Europe, particularly common in Scandinavia, but common enough, particularly in Scotland and in Wales, generally speaking, a few of them in North Germany, almost none in southern Europe. So blondes are a little tiny patch of a very rare kind of human being. So how do they get there? Well, actually, it's more or less the same story as the white skin and sunlight and vitamin D story. It turns on the origin of farming. Farming began several times across the globe, but European farming began around 10,000 years ago in the Middle East, somewhere where the Garden of Eden might have been, in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. Okay? And the early farmers went through a complete revolution in what they ate. And they also incidentally had a complete collapse in their health. If you look at the bones, the skeletons of the first farmers, the hunter-gatherers were sort of tall and handsome and healthy. The first farmers were small, crabbed, bent, bad teeth, signs of vitamin deficiency in their bones and the like, because they'd shifted to eating just grains. We're doing exactly the same here today, but the opposite way around. I had, when I was young, rather a good balanced diet. Now everybody eats cheeseburgers. I know you don't, but everybody else eats cheeseburgers, and we're paying the same price in health. Now, grains are interesting, at least the primitive grains of those days, because you can't grow grain anywhere. What grain needs is a warm springtime in order to germinate, to allow the seeds to grow. And that means you can't grow grain anywhere in the world north of a line that goes, roughly speaking, through Liverpool. Okay? So once you got to that line across Europe, you couldn't grow any grain. So the farmers stopped. There's one exception to that, and that's in northwest Europe, because there we have a warm spring, although I have to say, I've never noticed it in my 10 years in Edinburgh, but we have a relatively warm spring, and that's because of the Gulf Stream, which brings in, of course, warmth across the Atlantic from the tropics. So we have a warm spring in which you can grow grain and be a primitive farmer, but we don't have the sunny weather that goes with it. We've got cloud and rain and gloom and despair and that kind of stuff. So anybody who gets another mutation to very pale skin and blonde hair will be favoured. And farming is a rotten slide. But farming only got to southern England by about 7,000 BC, to Scotland by about 6,000 BC, to Scandinavia by about 4,000 or 5,000 BC. So the blonde mutation is only 5,000 or 6,000 years old, but it is still spread. And it's spread by natural selection. So that's another example of natural selection in humans. Let me end up by talking about the larger question. Certainly evolution works on us as a species. What evidence is that we're actually related to other creatures? Well, we've sequenced the human genome, 3,000 million base pairs of DNA, and it's all very baffling. We don't really understand the way it works at all. And we've also sequenced the chimpanzee genome, chimpanzee DNA, which is pretty much the same thing. Most of the genes are conserved, not all of them. Interestingly enough, if you compare ourselves with chimpanzees at the DNA level, well, the universal picture for almost all our attributes compared to theirs is one of decay. We're actually incomplete chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have all kinds of working genes that are broken and don't work in us. I don't know whether you've ever picked up a young chimpanzee. I don't recommend it because they're astonishingly strong. They're frighteningly strong. And that's because they have muscle proteins, particularly in the jaw muscle. If you've been bitten by a chimpanzee, I definitely don't recommend it. They have strong muscle proteins which have actually been greatly weakened in ourselves. Our muscles are much more feeble than theirs. They're nice and hairy. We're bald. Okay. We are shaved monkeys. They've kept their hair. We've lost ours. They smell wonderfully. I mean, by which I mean they can smell things and taste things which we can't smell and taste because our genes for smell and taste have lost nearly all their power. There's one across the DNA as a whole. There are lots and lots of similarities. Even so, here's a diagram which shows the slightly out of date, but the picture's about right. It shows the degree of gene share, the divergence of difference between humans and chimpanzees, 1%, 1.5%, 2%, on chromosomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on, all the way down to X and Y. And you can see that effectively on all the chromosomes, apart from X and Y, as we can see, chimps and humans on this slightly dated slide share about 98 or 99% of their DNA. Okay? There's the exception to that being X and Y. And there's an interesting issue you might like to bring up the next time you're in the pub, if you go to the pub with your friends. You could point out that science, through this diagram, points out quite clearly that women are closer to chimpanzees than men are, because women have got 2 X chromosomes, okay, which are very close to the chimpanzee X chromosome. Men have got a Y chromosome, which is diverged further away from the Y, so you can perhaps discuss that later as whether or not it's true. So that's the similarities of humans and chimps, and they're no doubt very, very real. However, there's one crucial difference, and that's this, the brain. And if we look at the human brain versus the chimp brain, simply in terms of size, if you correct for body weight, our brains are about 5 times as big as chimpanzee brains. And that's a big, big difference. And I kind of think we know that we're smarter than chimpanzees. Many people are looking at the genes of the human brain, and then actually the genetics is rather hard to pin down as to why the human brain is so much bigger. What seems to be happening, there seems to be many more connections within the human brain. It seems to be much more interconnected as well as being bigger. But that's, of course, the big, big difference, and that allows us to do all kinds of things which chimpanzees can't do. So we can say, indeed, that to a hardline evolutionist, if we forget the brain, we are just chimpanzees. So maybe that diagram of the terrified servant and the gorilla in the monkey jacket was quite reasonable. Well, I would say yes, but, okay? And this diagram shows you the but. let me talk you through this picture, which is the last family tree I'll show you. What this is a family tree of relatedness of humans and chimpanzees and of gorangs and gorillas based on a particular kind of DNA carried in a cell organelle called the mitochondria. I'm sure you all know what the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, where all that boring biochemistry happens. It's got a bit of DNA, which has been much studied, and you can make family trees based on mitochondrial DNA. And what we've got here are these various creatures, humans shown in red, the others in different colours, and the length of each line showing the amount of divergence of that individual from whom the mitochondria was taken compared to the others with which it's being compared. And at first sight, this makes the case. Humans, they just showed chimpanzees. Those red lines sit right in the middle of these gorillas, orangutans, and western chimpanzees. But the second glance, I think, makes a crucial point as how different we are. Because all those red lines, the human lineages, they're very, very short. What that tells us is there's almost no genetic differentiation among the peoples of the world. There is as much genetic difference between two groups of chimpanzees living 100 miles apart in West Africa as there is between the population of Scotland and the population of Papua New Guinea. Okay? So as you can see, these groups of chimpanzees, here and here, are probably living about as far apart as London and Aberdeen. But they're enormously different. Humans are nearly all the same. And that's because, in some senses, we are the primate that did not evolve. At least we didn't evolve in our bodies because we evolved in our minds. And we can really see that in all kinds of ways. Actually, I'll skip that, okay? We can see the way in which our brains have got bigger. Here's a diagram of the volume of human brains over the age of various of our ancestors from the fossil record. And I won't bore you with the details of exactly who they were, but as you can see, if we go a long way back, 3 to 3.5 million years ago, our brain size was a lot smaller, rapidly got bigger, until it got pretty big. And in fact, the brains of modern humans are remarkably enough smaller than those of Neanderthals. But that's really only because Neanderthals were much bigger than we were physically. If you correct for that, they're about the same size. So modern humans, which appeared on Earth 120, 150,000 years ago, they had brains the same size as us, but they weren't like us at all. I mean, they were maybe physically like us, but mentally, in all kinds of other ways, they weren't like us at all. I have the rather dubious privilege of living in Camden Town in London. I suppose I don't know what the equivalent is, living at what used to be, what the Boston Oak Leith Walk used to be like. I don't think it's like that anymore. It's really a pretty rough part of town. If I were to get on the tube at Camden Town in the morning, and a Cro-Magnon man, an early modern human, was to come and sit next to me, I probably wouldn't notice. He might be covered in furs and grunting a bit, but this is Camden Town, what do you expect? Because physically, that person from 100,000 years ago, a bit less, would be almost exactly the same as me. But of course, mentally, and intellectually, and socially, and behaviourally, he or she would be entirely different from me. Imagine the thoughts of that unfortunate early modern human sitting on the tube. It would be utterly and completely as if it was on a different planet, going underground at speed with people making strange tweeting noises to each other, and tweeting each other on their mobile phones and waving leaves in front of their faces. What's going on? Everything's changed. Everything's changed, but it's changed mentally and not physically. And that really, I think, is the crucial point about what makes us human. We are unique. And we're unique in one very specific way, because humans have got language. We've kind of gone back to the story of William Jones. Language is the key. We don't know why we have language, and when it began, but there is one hint that it is a genetic effect. It's only a hint, and it's not as strong as it's been painted. There's one particular gene that, when it goes wrong, destroys the ability to understand grammar and to make complete sentences. It's found in a family in West London. It causes them some inconvenience, there's no question, but it's not life-threatening, and it has to do with a particular gene called FOXP2. Now, FOXP2 does lots and lots of things. There's no question. And this story is very, very incomplete. But in its incomplete form, it shows you perhaps what genetics might be able to tell you. Here's the brains of some of those kids when they're speaking. When I'm speaking, there's part of my left part of my brain called Broca's area, lights up. It's very busy. And you can see that with a brain scan. It comes out as a red patch there, okay, Broca's area, just there. And it's very specific to speech. Those kids, on the other hand, if you look at their brains on this scan when they're speaking, it's completely chaotic, okay? There's no rhyme, no reason about it. They're not able to speak properly. So it's an error, it's an inherited disease, an inherited condition associated with language. If you can find this gene, FOXP2, not just in humans, but plenty of other creatures too, here's a family tree based on DNA changes of FOXP2 in humans, chimps, orangutans, and indeed in mice. Now, there are two kinds of DNA change, those that actually alter the structure of proteins, the things that build, the things that make us, the meat of our bodies, the meat of our brains indeed, and those that don't. And the ones that don't are shown, they're silent changes, they're called. They don't seem to do much, they do something but not much. The ones that do have no physical effect or little physical effect are shown as black lines. The ones that have a real effect on changing a protein are shown in grey squares. And you can see humans have got two changes in the FOXP2 genes, which in working parts of the molecule, which differentiates them from chimps. I think it would be a mistake to say that that's the gene for language, but it suggests that the ability to have language may indeed be genetic. There's a huge amount more done on the genetics of language I haven't got time to talk about, but once you've got language, everything changes. You've invented a new kind of descent with modification, a new kind of genetics, a new kind of evolution, because you can pass information on through words and not just through sperm and egg. Okay? The only way in which a chimpanzee can adapt to the world around it over the years is by evolving in response, and we've seen that when we look at chimpanzee DNA. Once we have language, we can change our behavior. We can actually transmit information not just vertically, but as I am now, horizontally. We can fossilize what we discover. We can write books, in other words, and those books can be rediscovered 500 years later or 5 years later, and the information is there. It can be put together to make sciences such as biochemistry and all the other wonderful things. So language changes everything, and we are, I can tell you, the only species that's got language. And once you've got language, you're almost all powerful. You can do amazing things with language. Here are the patterns of life and death in England, and the figures would have been the same in Scotland over the past centuries. Of every million children born, how many made it to 21 years old? Roughly speaking, Shakespeare's time, about 1 in 3. Roughly speaking, Darwin's year of birth, 1809, about 1 in 2. In 2001, 99% of all children who survive the first month make it to be 21 years old. Why is that? It's because we've changed our way of life, because we've informed each other about sewage works, about safety belts, about vaccines, all these things. No other creature can do that. We are completely unique in that respect. And that's really, I think, to end up, is the take-home lesson of my talk. Evolution is no good at understanding things which are unique, because it's a comparative science. It compares species with each other, and if only one species has got language, it can tell you very little about it. As I said, I was brought up in West Wales, in Aberystwyth, which is a small town on the coast, which in my day, my childhood, was very much a Welsh-speaking town. Still is, if there are English-speaking people in the room, I would say. My father once told me a joke, which he didn't realise was actually a rather profound statement about evolution. It turns on a Chinese restaurant in Aberystwyth. Aberystwyth is only a Chinese restaurant, still there, where somebody goes into this Chinese restaurant, a Welsh speaker, and serve a very nice Chinese meal by a clearly Chinese waiter who speaks perfect Welsh. So the customer beckons over the owner, and he says to the owner, in Welsh, but I'll translate for you, he says to the owner, "Well, where do you get this fellow from? Extraordinary, a Chinaman who can speak Welsh." And the owner looks a bit alarmed, and he said, "Oh, keep your voice down, boyo. He thinks he's learned English." And when you think about it, that actually has rather an important message in it. Because to a Chinese speaker, Welsh and English are just dialects of a language called Indo-European. They're almost the same. To an English speaker, the Cantonese and Mandarin, two major tongues that attack the other one, the three major languages of China, they're all the same. But the speakers of each one can't understand each other in China. Because we have all these languages scattered around the world, we can actually see the way they're different, how different they are, how they evolved, and we can even guess at when they began to split apart. Let's put ourselves forward 100 years, and there's only one language in the world, and that's probably going to happen. I don't think it's going to be Welsh. It might be English. Perhaps more likely it's going to be Chinese. And let's get rid of all the fossils by burning all the books or reformatting all the compact discs, which is what's going to happen. Then we'll only have Chinese or English. We would know nothing about language. We couldn't know where it came from, how the grammar worked, how old it was, whether it was infinitely old, whether it was 10 years old. We wouldn't know any of this at all. And that's because evolution is a comparative science. I can't understand something if it's unique. So I guess that's the take-home lesson of my talk, really. The Darwinism, evolution, can tell you everything you need to know about being human. The part, that is, from the interesting stuff. So I'll stop there. Thank you.